Good evening, welcome. Thank you for joining us at the John Adams Institute. My name is Tracy Metz, and I am the current director, but we also have with us two previous directors. Yes. And they are both women very special to my heart, Monique Knape and Anna Wertheim. And Anna is really the lady who put this institute on the map, who brought me in as a moderator. Many thanks to you still after all these years, Anna, for all that you've done for the John Adams. And Monique is also a special person for me in my own relationship to the John Adams. She brought me into the board. And then just as I was leaving the board, our then director, Russell Shorto, decided to move back to the US and said, well, you should do this. And I said, oh. So I turned around and came in through the other door. And now in November, it will be 9 years that I'm the director already. So thank you. Before we get started on our project of the evening, the wonderful novel Booth, another few words of thanks to the publishing house New Amsterdam, of course, which took it upon them to translate this book. And I do hope that if you speak Dutch, you'll consider buying the Dutch edition. You know how important it is that books like this continue to be translated. So that's why we have to buy the book. Although you will be forgiven if you're an English speaker and buy it in English. That's okay. And also many thanks to Oba, our partner in all sorts of wonderful events. It's a pleasure working with the Oba and being able to use this wonderful space to enrich the cultural life of Amsterdam, which I think is what we do. And I have another special little last word, but is he here? Jesus? Oh, he's still outside. Okay, he'll come in later, and you can all say hello to him afterwards. We have our very first American intern, and that is Jesus Labastida Munguia, and he is studying to be a history teacher at the University of Utah. So he's standing outside. He actually bought a jacket today for this. He'd kill me if he knew I told you that. But he looks very sharp, so you can compliment him with his jacket. And of course, our most important word of welcome is to our author of this evening, Karen Joy Fowler. Karen, thank you so much for coming all this way to be with us. You just told me that the first time you were in Amsterdam was on your honeymoon, which was how long ago? 50 years. 50 years. Well, Amsterdam was a very different city then, but I'm sure, at least I hope you still have loving memories of Amsterdam and are enjoying being back in spite of the very Dutch weather. Her book, Booth, puts a new light on two of America's greatest known events and two of its most iconic characters. One beloved, of course, Abe Lincoln, and the other reviled, John Wilkes Booth, his assassin. And the book is fascinating for many reasons, but not in the last place because of the way it walks a fine line between history and fiction. And part of that fiction, I'm sad to say, is about the women in the story of the Booth family. Karen Joy couldn't find anything about them and had to sort of create them for this book. So I think that is a telling anecdote about the place of women in history and hopefully how that has changed. She tells the story through John Wilkes' siblings. And of course, he and his siblings were actors following the path of their rather difficult father. And I was shocked to learn, I must have heard this at school, but it was too long ago, that the theater in which John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln was actually the theater where his family had played for years. And somehow, to me, that made the story so much more poignant and sadder that this should be the location both of their glory and of their, or at least his, demise. And I think it's fantastic the way, I remember in I think it was 4th grade, I had to present a little thing like you do at school about the Emancipation Proclamation. And it took me forever to learn how to pronounce Emancipation Proclamation. I can still do it. And the connection to the Civil War and the story of this tortured family and the way Karen succeeds in putting this in the context of what was tearing apart America then and is now also tearing America apart again. So with these cheery words, I will put you in the hands of our moderator this evening. She's with us for the first time, so we're really looking forward to hosting you. Thank you for joining us, Katie Hull, professor at the University of Amsterdam and author of a book. Well, you tell us yourself about your book. Yeah, baby? Yes. Okay. The floor is yours, Katie Hull.
Okay, well, I'm not sure my book's going to integrate itself naturally into the conversation, so we'll see. I think we're here for more important things. What makes a murderer? This question permeates Karen Joy Fowler's latest novel. Fowler is a Booker Prize shortlisted novelist whose book, We're All Completely Beside Ourselves, also won the PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction. One of her previous novels, The Jane Austen Book Club, was a New York Times bestseller and notable book, and was made into a quite lovely movie, starring, among others, Emily Blunt. Booth, in turn, has been nominated for the 2022 Booker Prize. Fowler's also a writer of short stories, as well as the current chair of the Clarion Foundation, which supports writers of science fiction and fantasy. And I could even tell from our dinner conversation, there was a real glow in your eyes as you spoke about science fiction and fantasy. And I think we can see some of the seeds of this new novel in a short story, which she wrote and I read. She wrote it some 25 years ago, in which time travelers show up in Washington, D.C. to gawk at the assassination of President Lincoln. Across all her novels and short stories, Fowler masterfully observes relationships between family members, friends, and lovers. Booth explores these relationships in very relatable ways. We read about corrosive sibling rivalries and parenting styles that contain a potentially toxic combination of loving indulgence and not so benign neglect. And we read about how alcoholism and what would today be called, I think, mental illness can tear through the fabric of a family. So these are really universal themes, and I think they're part of what makes Booth such a compelling read. But at the same time, as Tracy's introduction also made clear, and I'm sure you all know because that's why, in a sense, you're here, this book is not your ordinary family drama. It's the story of the family of one of the most notorious men in America. And for many Americans, as well as non-Americans, the name alone, John Wilkes Booth, evokes brain flashes of a man with a gun in a theater. He is, of course, the all-too-famous murderer of Abraham Lincoln. But from the title of the book until the very last page, Fowler's determined to shift the focus away from the man himself. It's almost as if she's telling us that murderers get too much attention. And her goal instead is to explore the culture that birthed and nurtured John Wilkes Booth. And as a historian, I was really interested in this sort of enabling environment that Fowler describes, both on the familial level and on the kind of wider national and cultural level, and that's something I would really love to talk to you about in our conversation. And the ways it's sort of so bound up in 19th century concepts of race and masculinity. Although, of course, questions remain about how much has changed and how much has stayed the same when it comes to race and gender in the United States. And Booth, I think, prompts us as readers to reflect on this very issue, how much has changed, how much has stayed the same. And while Fowler's prose remains crystal clear throughout her novel, I felt that the story she tells is an ambiguous one. For instance, around the compromising and compromised position of an ostensibly progressive family. And while Booth certainly poses again and again the question of what makes a murderer, for me at least, answers to this question really flickered only in and out of focus. So what remained in the end for me was a tale of complicity, guilt and shame on an individual, familial, and national level. And I think that was really what I found so touching and also so timely in this book. I can't wait to discuss Booth with Karen and all of you this evening. A quick word about the format for the event. Karen will take the floor for around 30 minutes, I believe. Then she and I will have a conversation around some of the aspects of the book, and then we'll open up to all of your questions and certainly allow plenty of time for that. I don't remember what time we're supposed to finish. How long's the event? 90 minutes? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen, for joining us, and please all join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much for those two beautiful introductions. Thanks to the John Adams Society for bringing me here. I'm absolutely thrilled. Thanks to my publisher and my wonderful translators who are here. I have felt very loved the whole time I've been here, and I'm very grateful. I'll see if I can put a stop to that now. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then some of the issues that the book has continually raised for me. So as Katie told you, I sort of started with the Booths with a short story. It's called Standing Room Only. And I live in Santa Cruz, California. I had read a number of time travel stories, and they had begun to irritate me. They had begun to irritate me because they made it look as if it would be fairly easy to pass if you went back 200, quick change of clothing, and you're good to go. Like Amsterdam, Santa Cruz is a city that tourists visit. I started thinking of time travel as a form of tourism, and I started thinking about how easily I can spot the tourists in Santa Cruz. I'm sure you feel that way as well, that I thought if I can spot someone from Kansas, I bet I could spot someone from 200 years in the future even more easily. And I went from that to thinking of the sort of tourism that time travel would be, and that there would be destination vacations. There would be groups that would go visit major events. And one of them I thought was Abraham Lincoln's assassination. I thought that there would probably be tours that would go to see Washington, D.C. on the day that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So I wrote a short story. Again, I think it's called Standing Room Only, and it takes place on the day of the Lincoln assassination, and Washington, D.C. is just awash in time travelers. The point of view character is Anna Surratt, the 16-year-old daughter of Mary Surratt, who was the woman hanged as part of the conspiracy to kill Lincoln. And so Anna Surratt does not understand that she is surrounded by time travelers, but I thought that readers would spot them easily. I turned out to be mistaken about that, apparently. Apparently time travelers are not as easy to spot as I imagined they would be. There are probably several of you in the audience now. I went from that to another story prompted by the research I'd done about the Booth family, which was published quite recently and which is called The Beautiful Passing. It's about the father of the Booth family, a vegetarian man very interested in Christianity and in religion in general, but I think he would not identify himself as a Christian. And during his life, considered to be the most famous Shakespearean actor in America, much beloved by people like Walt Whitman, who were enamored of his genius. He was equally famous for his fantastic performances and for his bouts of public insanity, which were quite colorful. If you are a famous person and you strip all of your clothes off, climb a tree, and crow like a rooster, it's going to be in the papers, and people will notice. People will notice that you have done this. And his story is filled with incidents of this sort. So in this story, the beautiful passage, the beautiful passing, it involves a historical incident which took place in Kentucky when he was touring there. And he sent late at night for a reverend to come. He sent a note to the church. He said, "There's been a death. I need you to attend me." And the reverend was a man named James Freeman Clarke. He was a very young man at the time. Later in his life, he was also quite a famous figure in American history, famous abolitionist. And he came home from the evening he spent with Junius Booth, and he wrote a fairly lengthy description of it. So my story is based off of this description. What Junius Booth, the death Junius Booth wanted him to pay attention to, I guess James Freeman Clarke at one point, because Booth seemed slow to get to the point of the death that had caused him to send for Clarke. Clarke asked if the deceased was a relative, and Junius Booth said distant, very distant. It turned out the deceased was actually a flock of passenger pigeons who he had gone to the market the day before, and he had bought every dead passenger pigeon. He had purchased a casket. He had purchased ground in a cemetery, and he wanted James Freeman Clarke to officiate at the burial of the passenger pigeons. They spent an evening arguing about whether animals had souls or not. James Freeman Clarke eventually sadly declined to perform this service. Junius Booth went ahead without him, ended up arrested for having told a group of people that Jesus had been killed for eating fish. Because Junius was a passionate vegetarian himself. He felt that the crime that sent Jesus to the cross was the fish and loaves dinner, in which fish was obviously eaten, and he ended up arrested. He spent a couple of nights in jail, got out and continued with his Shakespearean performances. So I wrote that short story, and then I happened on a contemporaneous account of the night Edwin Booth, the older brother of John Wilkes, returned to the stage after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, a very moving account in the New York Times. And I wrote a third story about that called Booth's Ghost. And by then, I was just so thoroughly enmeshed in the Booth family, about whom I had known almost nothing when I started this enterprise of the short stories. And I began to read more about them, and I began to regale my friends with odd stories of things the Booths had said and done. And at a certain point, my friends, obviously, their patience tried to the max, said, just write a book. Just go write a book. So that's what I did. When I pictured the book initially, the question I had in mind was about the impact of the assassination on John Wilkes' family, particularly on his brothers and sisters. I pictured a book in which the assassination would happen fairly early in the book, and what we would mostly deal with would be the aftermath. I would look at what the consequences in the rest of their lives this act had had on his siblings. But the more research I did, the more interested I became in all of the things that went before. And so when I actually wrote the book, I significantly revised my plans, and the assassination instead happens quite late in the book, almost at the very end. And the book is instead all of the things leading up to it. I think there were a number of reasons for making this switch. One of them, and probably the main one, was the assassination, the election of Donald J. Trump. Wow. Wow. I don't know how to recover from that. I really, truly did not believe Trump would be elected. I was in England at the time. I assured everyone, because so many people were more worried than I was, I assured them all that this would never happen. And when it did, I was really undone by it. I had thought from my place of privilege that the election of Barack Obama meant something about my country, about where my country was in terms of race relations. And it was devastating to me to learn that I was wrong about that, and that my country was not, that the election of Barack Obama did not mean what I had imagined that it meant. I literally took to my bed. I did a couple of things. I took to my bed, I got a dog. I thought, I have had dogs most of my life. I had put one down a couple of years before. I thought, that's my last dog. I can't do this again. I can't possibly go through this again. I will never get another dog. And then Trump was elected, and I thought, I can't do this without a dog. So I went to the pound, and I brought home, as it turns out, the perfect dog. If only I were here with you tonight to talk about my dog. What a great time we would have. And the other thing I did was to put my book away. I had started thinking about the mass shootings that happen so frequently and to the rest of the world so bewilderingly in America, and the impact on the families of the shooters, which had led me to the Booths with whom I had been spending my time for a while. But there just didn't seem to be any point to it anymore. And I put it away. And my agent told me that she had 7 writers call her the week of Trump's election and say that they were not going to finish the books that they had been working on. So I was not the only one to think there's just no point to writing this. And when I picked it back up, and as I said, I reimagined it as focusing on the years leading up to the Civil War and the assassination, I began to notice quite late how pertinent to the moment it actually was. I have lived through some pretty tumultuous times in my country's history. I was born in 1950. I was a child and a young adolescent during the civil rights movement, which impacted me very profoundly. I was at Berkeley during the anti-war movement. I do not remember another time in which it has seemed so much the case that that half of the country thinks of the other half as an enemy. That there is just that this is not a we can agree to disagree sort of situation, but that the people who do not agree with you must be silenced one way or another. And it's a terrifying thing to see. And it involves in so many ways the same issues that the Civil War involved. The issues that we have just never been able to settle, particularly the ones involving race. So when I picked the book back up again, it no longer seemed like a book that was pointless to be writing. It seemed instead very, very relevant to the things I was thinking and the time that I was living through. Am still living through. I saw a poll just today that said if the presidential election were held today, Trump would get 43% of the vote and Biden would get 41%, which is just too terrifying to think about. So I became very focused on the Civil War, on the period around the Civil War, on the accommodations made after the Civil War to try to bring the South, which had, spent every ounce of blood that it could to leave the country, to try to stitch together an actual country, having forced half of the country to remain. And all of these things are things I was thinking about throughout the book, as well as the particular people in this family. They are an extremely fascinating group in my mind. I had this difficulty the whole time because I really did not want to write a book about John Wilkes Booth. I thought he has just gotten so much attention over the years, and he doesn't deserve it. And, Stephen Sondheim has written songs about him. He does not deserve Stephen Sondheim songs. And I did not want to give him my attention. I really wanted to think about his brothers and sisters and what it would be like if your brother and your beloved brother was the most hated man in America, what that would be like. But it was, a sort of constant conundrum that on the one hand, I'm trying to pretend that I'm not writing a book about John Wilkes Booth, and on the other hand, we all understand that I would not be writing the book at all without John Wilkes Booth. So a constant balancing act of trying to keep the focus where I wanted it to be and not where it naturally goes. I think I had a real mission in my head to prove to people, or at least to argue, that people who don't kill presidents are just as interesting as people who do. And I, having spent some time with his family, I would not put John Wilkes Booth in the top 3 most interesting people in this family. I think at best he would come in maybe 5th. The one person in the family remaining that I feel I have not given enough attention to, that I am still very interested in, is the youngest brother, Joe. Joe, one of his acquaintances remarked at some point that he was either a very stupid person or he did an incredible impression of being a very stupid person. He joined the Confederate Army as a doctor after Fort Sumter was fired on, and quickly deserted, and then a couple of months later joined the Union Army, and understanding that he was not to be made an officer immediately, deserted there too. And I think there just cannot be very many people who in the course of 1 year deserted both the Confederate and the Union Army. So he remains very interesting to me. He's the one brother who was not an actor, which also puts him on the outskirts of this family. When I started, I did not know very much about the family. I did not know that, with the exception of John Wilkes Booth, they were pro-union, they were anti-slavery, they identified very strongly with the North, and that particularly the middle brother, Edwin, who was the most famous of the acting brothers, was a tremendous supporter of Abraham Lincoln, very proud of the fact that he had voted for Abraham Lincoln. It was the occasion of an enormous fight between the two brothers in which Edwin threw John from the house over the political argument over Abraham Lincoln, something that their mother believed led to the assassination, that Edwin casting John out from the family for his very different political views was a critical factor in his decision to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. I think that, well, I know, because I've read their comments in the comment sections, I know that some readers are disappointed that I don't more explicitly settle the issue of why John Wilkes Booth murdered Abraham Lincoln. In many ways, he seems like a very unlikely assassin. He was successful, he was handsome, he was apparently such a dish that when he left, that stage managers had to come on before his performances and beg the ladies in the audience to act like ladies when he was on. And for all his political differences and his arguments with Edwin, his family adored him. So he seems like an unlikely person to have taken this incredibly dastardly act. And I don't really answer that question because I can't, because it's not that that I don't have ideas about what his motivations might have been. It's that there are too many ideas. I don't know, which ones were the most persuasive in his mind. He clearly had a sense of himself as someone with a destiny, someone who was going to do something important, someone who was going to be remembered. And I think partly that came from growing up with Shakespeare just all around him, this sense of his life as large and his destiny as large. Also, it's very possible that he was just sort of a puppet in the hands of other people working for the Confederacy, particularly a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle. It's not clear the extent to which they orchestrated his actions, but it seems very possible that they did. The family suffered, not just Junius, the father, but several members of the family suffered from a strain of insanity, and it's possible that John Wilkes Booth just became somewhat insane over the war. He also appears to have been completely drunk the whole week before the assassination, and perhaps not making the most wise decisions that he could make. So again, it's not that I don't have ideas about things that might have been influential. It's that I cannot narrow it down to one or even two. I'm going to read a very short section from the book, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more just about the whole enterprise of writing historical fiction. And I have chosen this section in particular to talk about those issues. The book is written with 3 points of view. The oldest daughter, Rosalie, is one point of view character. The middle brother, Edwin, is one point of view character. And the youngest daughter, Asia, is one point of view character. But there is also a great deal of omniscient narration in it, where I am appearing on the page to make sure that you understand what I want you to understand in the bossiest possible way. So this section is a little of both. It's in the section from Asia's point of view, and involves, Asia actually left behind 3 books and a number of letters. So these incidents come out, this incident comes out of Asia's book that she wrote about John. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else you need. I don't think so. They are at home at the Booth farm, and they are being visited by a school friend of John's. John's friends from St. Timothy's Hall come to call. Samuel Arnold sometimes, but far more often, Jessie Wharton. Asia is surprised to hear John referred to as Billy. She learns that Billy Bowlegs was John's nickname at school, chosen because John's legs curve like his father's did, and inspired by the Seminole chief, Billy Bowlegs. It's quite clear that this nickname is meant more affectionately for John than for Bowlegs, and that John takes it as intended. But Asia suspects that since he never spoke of this, John must not like it very much. Jessie Wharton is a handsome boy with a wide smile and an open, readable face. He and John and Asia walk through the woods together, the leaves now more brown than red. But the sun is out, and the day is mild enough to sit on the steps down to the spring. The boys smoke their pipes, and the smell of tobacco wafts about. Asia fills and empties her cupped hand with cold water, listening to the music of it falling, but also to Jessie. He tells a story she's never heard before, a story of a wild river and a day in which John, sucked under by a powerful current, nearly drowned, which makes Asia suddenly remember a dream she'd had. She has a brief image of John floating face down amongst books and chairs. For just a moment, she can't breathe. We thought we'd lost him for sure, Jessie says. We thought he'd never open those big eyes for us again. He throws his arm over John's shoulders, and John lays his cheek briefly on Jessie's hand. A thin column of smoke rises like a charmed cobra from the bowl of his pipe. No, I'm not to drown, he says. Nor burn, nor hang. Though my sister has long believed, I'm marching towards a martyr's death. Does Asia believe that? She doesn't want to. Years later, she will write that it was a golden afternoon. She will write of her deep contentment, how she watched the 2 boys leaning together in the sunshine, so gifted, so beautiful, so brilliant, and wondered about their futures. Surely both would leave a shining mark upon the world. 8 years later, in April of 1862, Jessie Wharton will be killed in the Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. A captured Confederate, he'll be shot by the sentry on duty. Maybe he stuck his head out of the window, refused to retreat, and abused the sentry with awful oaths and the taunt that he was too cowardly to shoot. Maybe he was quietly minding his own business. In fact, had just looked up from his mother's favorite Bible verse when he was murdered suddenly and without cause. It all depends on whom you ask. All of this was known to Asia when she wrote about his shining mark. But on that lovely quiet afternoon, she was unaware and unconcerned. The war was several years and a handful of verses to the beautiful Miss Booth in the future. So what I like about this section is that, an omniscient viewpoint allows you to tell the reader things that the characters do not know. But what I like about it in this particular instance is that it also allows me to come clean about the things I don't know. So I have read both versions of Jessie Wharton's death. I have no way of knowing which is accurate. In fact, my suspicion is that neither is accurate, that I feel his mother's favorite Bible verse, that's just a step too far. And the idea that he taunted the sentry into killing him seems to me defensive, a way, the murder of an unarmed prisoner is a pretty indefensible thing, and this is a way to try to make it seem less egregious. So I believe neither of them, but I don't have another alternative to put forward. And this brings me to a lot of thinking I've been doing recently about the whole project of writing historical fiction. So these are my issues. We know that memory is very unreliable. We know that eyewitness accounts are very unreliable. And yet history is mostly memory and eyewitness accounts. And the extent to which any of it is accurate is always going to be extremely difficult to determine. In the case of the Booths, you have the added difficulty of this momentous event that after the murder of Abraham Lincoln, newspapers and magazines all over the country tried to find anybody who had known the Booths, and they paid for stories about the Booths. And obviously, the more sensational the stories were, the more the newspapers were interested in them. So you have this mitigating factor of people being encouraged to remember things in the most salacious way they possibly could. I'm going to add to this a personal story, which is that my whole life, I was told about this ancestor that I had who fought for the Union in the Civil War, although fought is maybe not quite as accurate as it could be. My grandfather wanted to join one of those clubs of, sons of the Civil War. And in order to do so, he had to prove that he had an ancestor who fought. And the ancestor in our family was a man named Tom Burke. And the problem was that there are two Tom Burkes. One of them was shot as a deserter, and one of them died of malaria before seeing battle at all. And Grandpa could join his club if the Tom Burke was the one who died of malaria, but he could not join his club if the Tom Burke was the one who was shot as a deserter. So again, this is a story with some detail. Imagine my surprise then when my sister-in-law got very interested in genealogy and started looking at our family, and it turns out that the earliest ancestor I have was a man who came to the U.S., was a man named Patrick Burke, and he came in the 1870s. There is no Tom Burke in my family history. There is no one from my family who was in the United States during the Civil War. So, when I got over the shock of that, I started being curious about who made this story up and why and to what point. And if you were going to make up a story, wouldn't it be a better story? Wouldn't there be, more drama in it? Wouldn't there be battles? My suspicion has settled on my Aunt Elvira. For this reason, my Aunt Elvira also told me once that my Uncle Bob had had a torrid affair with Georgia O'Keeffe. She claimed there were letters between the two of them, very passionate letters in fact so filthy that she was forced to burn them before showing them to anybody else. So you put together the unreliability of memory, the unreliability of eyewitness accounts, and the fantasists among us who, for their own entertainment, make up these other stories, and you are left really wondering what it means to talk about history. There was a long time when I was content just to sort of call it all fiction. It seemed like a very easy, defensible place to be, just to not think too much about what I could prove or, what seemed reliable. And in writing Booth, that was one of the major issues, was there's a lot of information, there are a lot of people interested in this family. Sifting through all of that information and trying to decide what seemed authoritative was a large part of the project, because I did want to be as accurate as I was able to be. But I'm not happy with that answer anymore, now that we live in a time of alternate facts and powerful conspiracy theories. I'm no longer content just to pretend that we can throw it open. Now that, there are actual bills in various states in the U.S., particularly in Florida, arguing that we won't teach actual history to our children because it would be too upsetting to them to learn what actually happened. In this context, I am no longer willing to side with the people who say, well, just choose what you like, whatever. It's all open for grabs. So I've been thinking a great deal about history, about how we approach it, how we know what we think we know, how much of it we can feel we do actually know, the purposes to which history is put. One of the things that I think is maybe less true in the Netherlands, I am guessing is less true in the Netherlands, is that in America, the actual attempt to teach accurate history instead of becoming something that we share and that unifies us, has become something that divides us, that we do not share. And the way you choose to tell, particularly the story of the Civil War, is very contested and very divisive, and always has been, and continues to be. You are probably aware of all of the efforts involved in bringing down the Confederate monuments and the Confederate statues and the backlash to these things. I've got no answers. These are just things that I am obsessively thinking about these days. And I think when you write a historical novel, I picture it as a sort of continuum with novel at one end and history at the other, and the novel can fall anywhere along that line. In Booth, I have tried to fall close to the history end. I have tried to the best of my ability to talk about things I believe happened and to depend a lot on contemporaneous accounts and letters and things that I feel a certain confidence in. But I will never feel absolutely confident, and there were many, many gaps, as Tracy said, particularly around the oldest sister, whom I had to largely make up. I think the two other characters who are my point of view characters, Edwin and Asia, left a lot of material behind to work with, but Rosalie didn't. And because so many people tell me that Rosalie is their favorite character, which always makes me feel a little concerned because I made her up and I did not make the others up. I was able to make her nicer. I would have loved for Asia to have been nicer. I would have given anything for Asia to be a really nice person, but there are her letters telling you that she was not. But because so many people have attached to Rosalie, I will tell you a bit of Rosalie's story that is true, and then I will talk to Katie. So although I had very little about Rosalie, what I did have I thought was pretty delicious. In her end of her teenage years, 1920, she fell in love with a lion tamer. And I think, other people who have maybe done historical research will understand that you are just always hoping for a lion tamer, and you almost never get one. So this was amazing and wonderful, and it was a very brief romance, and not at all clear to me even the extent to which it was mutual. Certainly, it became an incredibly important part of Rosalie's identity. She talked about it for the rest of her life, and she lived for many years. She had her friends knitting mufflers for her long-lost lion tamer, paramour. But at the very end of her life, she began to tell people that he had been killed and eaten by his lions, that this was how the romance had tragically ended, with his death at the paws of his very own lions, when in fact he had married someone else and was running a hotel in Ohio. And so, you know, although I had very little to go on with Rosalie, I feel you get a very complete character just from those few facts that, and I am putting some serious thought in. I've been married for 50 years. I hope to be married for another 50, but if my husband does die, the story I'm going to tell about how he died, I'm working hard on that. Thank you.
Just check. That sounds like it's working. And that clock up there, because I'm watchless, is correct. So, okay, brilliant. Amazing, and just, you know, so much to talk about. And obviously, we're not going to talk about everything I want to talk about, but I think a lot will come from the audience as well. I guess there were two things that I really wanted to talk about with you, and I think one gets back to this issue, and I think we'll leave it because it's going to come up anyway, about these various fragments that we have about what makes a murderer, right? And that, I mean, my own reading was that you were almost playing with my natural instinct as a human being to try to look for clues constantly. So I would sort of stumble along this. I was like, was this it? Was it the indulgent mother? Was it the jealousy with the brother? So, you know, more will come up, and I think maybe more pertinently some of the kind of bigger cultural issues that were producing someone who was of Southern sympathies in that family will come up in the conversation. So maybe to put that to one side for now. And something else that I found really amazing, and is just what's so beautiful about your writing, is this feeling, you know, we as readers can really connect. And we can really connect because of some of the things you write about feel very timeless on a human level, or they feel very relevant because of the current political and cultural climate in the United States. But then other things feel just as, you know, I often say, and it's not me who says it, who originally said it, this feeling that the past is a foreign country, right? And that in some ways life was really, really different. So I'd love to talk a little bit about some of those differences, and then maybe also move on to some of the similarities and parallels and resonance with the contemporary moment. And maybe in terms of the differences, we can think about three things, and you can add anything or refuse to talk about any of this stuff. But the position of African Americans, and I'd love you to tell the audience a little bit more about the Hall family and this kind of in-between status and paralyzed limbo-like status this family had, because that's so fascinating. Another thing that I found really interesting in terms of how different people's lives were was the lack of autonomy that some of your characters have. Rosalie's the most obvious one, but even Edwin, the middle brother, at times his life is really narrowed by decisions that his parents are making for him well into adulthood. And then the third thing is just, you know, the brutality of life, and this theme that comes up again and again of infant mortality, I think would be worth talking about. So I'll leave those out there, and if you want to elaborate on any of it, that would be great.
Yeah, those are all, I think, really interesting. I'll start with the last one, because I'll probably have to get you to remind me what the first one was. But one of the reasons I wanted Rosalie as a point of view character, in spite of there being so many unanswered questions about her as compared to her brothers and sisters, is that she was the one who witnessed the deaths of her brothers and sisters. So this was a family with 10 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood. And the 4 who died were all in the middle of the family. So you end up with a family where there are 2 much older children, the oldest brother June and Rosalie, the oldest daughter. And then there's a gap of 10 years, which was at one point filled with other children, but now is not. And then you have the 4 younger ones, which are Edwin, Asia, John, and Joe. And the 4 younger ones, I think, just had a totally different experience growing up. They were very close. The 4 were very tightly knit. And they did not remember their brothers and sisters. And they also did not remember, as Rosalie did, a time when their father was more stable, because a lot of the more flamboyant insanities really happened as a result, I think, of the death of the 4 children. So Rosalie had this vision of what the family had once been that the other 4 didn't, and I wanted to talk about that, and I wanted to talk about how powerfully deforming the deaths of these children I thought had been in the family dynamic, and Rosalie was the only one I thought who could really speak to that. I think that again, you know, their father is such a large figure in all of their lives, and one of the one of the puzzles to me in terms of the making of a murderer is that Edwin, the middle son, who was forced at a very early age to drop out of school to travel with his father because his father drank so much, they could not depend on him to make his curtains or to show up for his events, and the family was dependent on that income. So Edwin, at age 14, had to go along and try to keep his father out of the bars and try to see that he made his curtains. And this was just not a job that anyone could actually do, and his father was pretty abusive over his attempts to do it. So you have Edwin with this very difficult, lonely, kind of abused childhood. And then you have John, who stayed at home in the warmth of his mother's adoration and his sister's adoration and lived this cosseted life. And yet, John is the one who ended up angry. And Edwin, not so much. Edwin certainly felt aggrieved, but he didn't have the fury at the world that John always had. Of course, what also happens in the book periodically, I sort of think of it as a clock going through the book, is that we look at the Lincolns at various points. What was happening with Abraham Lincoln when this was happening with the Booths, and sort of chronology. And of course, they too lost almost all of their children. It's certainly something that it's, I think, hard for us to quite fathom, because I don't think that it was easier for them than it would have been for us, and yet it was just so very common and must have been terrifying. I also, I think, fairly frequently in terms of the past being a different country, about how dangerous childbirth was. I am one of the women who would not have survived childbirth if I had been born 100 years earlier. And this is the lens through which I enchantingly look at shows like Bridgerton, and I think, don't sleep with him. Are you crazy?
Right.
Is it worth your life?
Yeah.
So what was the, you had three. What was the first one?
Is this still on? Yeah. Well, I'll go back to those, but just on that comment of like sleeping with people being risky, there's this brilliant passage in the book where Edwin sends away his very young bride-to-be to kind of educate for a period of mandatory education to basically raise her in class. But you have this very kind of wry aside that the period, I forget how long it was, something like 9 months, happened to coincide with the period that it takes that long to recover from syphilis for him, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So
There is still at least one historian who believes that her death was caused by his disease, that she had a child and that inflamed the condition that she had gotten from him. I think this is pure speculation, but possible.
So I will go back to at least one of the other two, but on the issue of you saying you think that this is pure speculation, something I really noticed in the end of your talk just now, and the way you were talking about kind of your approach to history, and as a novelist, how careful you are with history and how careful you are with your sources, and how one should discount the fact that newspapers are going to include salacious details in them. If only all historians could be this careful, really. So one of the things I think I'd like to talk about in terms of hopefully differences, but unfortunately it does get us into the area also of similarities, is the position of African Americans and the position of the Hall family.
The Hall family. The Hall family, I think, are fascinating, and well worth a book of their own. What I know about the Hall family, I know because various local historians in Harcourt County, where the Booths grew up and the Halls grew up, have been interested in them and have done their best to piece together what they can. So, in Maryland, the apparatus of slavery was a very complicated one. Baltimore had the largest population of free black people in the country. And among the people who were not free, there were gradations. There were people who were slaves for life, and then there were what were called term slaves, so people who would be in slavery for a certain amount of time until they turned 25 or until they turned 30, and then they were to be freed. Partly, I think this was because Baltimore was a fairly common place for enslaved people to run. And from Baltimore you could get to Philadelphia, and this is what Frederick Douglass did, and this was not uncommon. So I think it was a way to try to persuade people not to run, to offer them a termination point where they would be free if they just stayed. So the Hall family, the Junius Booth, the father, well, let me go back even one more generation. Richard Booth, the grandfather, came to the U.S. to live with his son and all of their children and his wife from England. And he was, I think he was very shocked to have slavery all around him. It never seemed normal to him. And one of the interesting things for all of the interests that there have been in the Booths over so many years, and all of the research that's been done, is that there are still new things being found. And one of the relatively recent ones is that Richard Booth, the grandfather in the family, was a stop on the Underground Railroad, that he helped people who were running to get to Baltimore and from Baltimore to Philadelphia. So he was passionately anti-slavery. The next generation, Junius and Marianne, appear to have, they were opposed to slavery, but clearly willing to make accommodations. And so they had a farm that that was, mostly Junius Booth was on the road doing his acting, but the farm was still a functioning farm. And the man who managed the farm was a man named Joe Hall. Joe Hall was a slave when Junius Booth met him, and it's unclear whether Junius bought him or gave him the money to buy himself. But either way, it ended up with him being freed. So Joe Hall was a free black man running the Booth farm. He was married to a woman who was enslaved at a nearby plantation, and for many years, could never. She worked in the Booth household, where she was paid a wage, and I assume a wage was also paid to the plantation owner for her services. But she had to go back to the plantation every night. She could not spend the night with her husband. And they had a number of children, and because she was enslaved, the children were born into slavery. At a certain point, Joe Hall had saved up enough money to buy her freedom as well. And they continued to have children. And because she was now a free woman, all of the children born after she gained her freedom were born free. So you have this very complicated family dynamic in which some of the older brothers and sisters are enslaved and the younger brothers and sisters are free. And most of the people who worked the Booth farm were enslaved people. Again, they were not Junius Booth's slaves, and he paid them wages as well. But slavery was just all around them, and one of the difficult things to imagine for me is that Mary Ann Booth, the mother of John Wilkes Booth, had two kind of really close friends, her two best friends, and one of them was Ann Hall, and one of them was a woman whose name has suddenly fled my mind, Rogers, Auntie Rogers. And Ann Hall was initially enslaved by Auntie Rogers' father-in-law, and when he died, Auntie Rogers and her husband inherited the slaves that he had still had, which included some of the older Booth children. So you have this household where these two women are constantly in and out, and one of them owns the children of the other. It's just unfathomable to think about. But I think that because they grew up in America with slavery all around them, that although, with the exception of John Wilkes Booth, the rest of the family was anti-slavery, not with the passion that their grandfather had. They weren't as disturbed by it as their grandfather or even their father. They all kind of, they opposed it, but they made an accommodation with it.
Right, and I love, is it still working? I'm very paranoid about my mic. I love how you show that, because I think for me especially it kind of raised this question of complicity. And there was so much that I saw that was just so super historically accurate from what I know about the history of slavery, this kind of mythology of the happy slave, how so many of these kind of well-wishing white people still wanted to imagine that the enslaved were quite happy, quite content.
Still do.
Yeah, exactly, right? And that, the way that the white children and the black children grew up in some ways intertwined and playing together, but then as they aged, hierarchies emerged, and it was totally acceptable for the white adolescents to be impersonating and mocking a fully grown African-American man, right? So all these things I just found very chilling in the portrait and very accurate. I'm looking at the time. I could go on forever. I think so much is just going to come up from the audience, especially about the contemporary resonance and these issues of kind of who John Wilkes Booth was and why. So maybe we'll start throwing this
I'll just
around.
throw one thing out about the Halls. Well, you know, one of the most surprising things to me, and the families were very intertwined and very, very much in each other's company a lot. But one of the surprising things to me is that in the period after the assassination, when the countryside was being scoured by reporters for stories about the Booths and particularly about John Wilkes Booth, that they found Ann Hall, and they asked, a reporter asked Ann Hall, so, you know, what would you do if, John Wilkes was on the run at the time, what would you do if John showed up at your house? And she said, I would give him everything I have, which was not what I expected her to say.
Shall we? Any questions? Otherwise, I'll just ramble on forever. Okay. Let's see what my aim's like. This is all very novel. Okay. A lot's going to depend on the throw.
Oh, well done.
Is it on? Do I just speak? Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for coming over to Holland in the first place. I was really fascinated by your book. I studied American Studies, so everything was interesting, actually. I actually have two questions, but we'll see later. I was wondering, in writing a book, partly about the South, the North, all the terror, does it matter as a writer where you grew up? Because I think I hear a little bit of, I don't know, I was in North Carolina a lot, South Carolina, that area. And my aunt always says, why? I can't do it because I'm Dutch, you know? And I hear you say that with the WH. So then I started thinking about, does it matter where you grow up when you write a book that is about this historical fact?
Ask the second question as well.
Yeah, it's another one, very different. If you could write a book about a certain other historical period, what would you choose now? What are you interested in?
First of all, in your first question, I grew up in Indiana,
Okay.
which was part of the North. And I don't think of myself as having an accent, but I do often hear, particularly when I talk publicly, that I guess it gets stronger because people do notice it. They can't identify it because nobody knows where Indiana is, but they know it's odd. So I think probably it does matter. I've always grown up identifying very much with the North. For years, I thought I had an ancestor who was a Union soldier. Very proud of that, which is a ridiculous thing to be proud of because it has nothing to do with me, and yet I do miss him now that he's gone. And the way the war is talked about in the South is very, very different than the way it's talked about in the North. And I would think even, I think a lot of kids who grow up in the South and then go to college in a liberal arts university and often in a northern liberal arts university get a very different version. And this is as I was talking earlier about just how contested history is. There's a brand new book out by Sarah Churchwell called The Grapes of Wrath, and it's about the power of the narrative of Gone with the Wind, both the book and the movie, how influential they were, and and how a lot of the accommodation to try to persuade the South back into the country involved allowing them to believe their own narrative about the war, to allow that to take root, and not to contest the idea that there was something heroic in their, desperate stand for an old way of life, and sort of look past slavery to something involving states' rights, and so I can't guess. I don't think my feelings about the Civil War would be different if I had grown up in the South, but I might be more conscious of this other narrative. It was a great shock to me when I was in college, and I went to the South really for the first time since I'd been about 5. And I heard people talking about the War of Northern Aggression, which is just not the phrase we use in Indiana. And, Indiana is no paradise of brotherhood. I think in general the accommodation that was made was an agreement that North and South would unite over white supremacy. We wouldn't agree about the history of the war, and we might not agree about slavery, but we would agree about that. And that a lot of that is the Gone with the Wind story. So the second question was?
Historical period.
Oh, I'm very fond of the Victorians. I'm very drawn to that period. I'm particularly drawn to their adorable attempts at science. I've written a number of things in that period. I always seem to return to it. I wrote a story about Mary Anning, the great fossil hunter in Lyme, and all of the arguments over the dinosaurs and the fossils that were taking place then. Again, speaking of things that people have been interested in for many, many years, and yet we're always finding new things about. The idea that the dinosaurs had feathers is something that I am still struggling to change my mental image.
For me, it's those white Greek statues were all painted in garish colours.
Oh,
I struggle
yes.
with that one.
Yes.
I was just thinking about history wars and book banning. And if your book were called Booty, not Booth, then it could get banned. And then it would actually be very good for its sales. So there's nothing better for a book sale than getting your book banned. Yes, please. It is on a chair.
So I really enjoyed reading your book. One of the interesting things I found in the book. Oh, sorry. What I found really interesting, one of the things I found interesting in the book was when they travel from east to west and they go through the Panama Canal, I believe. I didn't realize that, or there was no canal, right? Through Panama, excuse me. I didn't realize that was really a route that was used much, and I was wondering how you found out about what it was like and how much that route was used and why they didn't go across the country when this seemed much more dangerous.
It was all very dangerous, I think. It was quicker, oddly enough. It was quicker to go down to Panama and cross on that very narrow part of the continent, and then pick up a ship. But it is a dire looking journey, and what amazes me is that his older brother, who worked in San Francisco, did it so many times that he came across to pick Junius up. He went back. He came to get a divorce. He went back. Eventually, the canal was in place, and then it wasn't a terribly dangerous journey anymore at all. But yeah, it was it was an adventure when they did it, for sure. And there's not a lot in the memoirs or letters about it. So I had, again, little bits, but I just read a lot about other people's journeys across that area and folded a lot of that in.
Yeah. I have another question which refers a bit to one of the answers of the question before. Maybe I misread this, but you made it very hard to hate John Booth. He was misguided, and I felt sorry for him at certain points. So you said he was very loved, but his family leaned upon him very harshly as well at some points. He was made too responsible as well. And you make Rosalie say, I love both my brothers, or all my brothers, but these two in particular. And maybe I just heard you say something about the North and South. Well, could you please explore this?
I think, because most of the information I had about sort of the daily family life involving John Wilkes came from his sister Asia's book, and she just adored him. So most of the information I got came through this adoring gaze. She wrote the book. She wrote a book about her father, and then she wrote a book about her brother Edwin. But they're very dry. They're about their theatrical careers, and they're not really intimate. And then she wrote a book about John, and she wrote it after the assassination, and it's clearly, the case for the defense. And she knew when she wrote it that she would not be able to publish it. And it was, she did die with the book unpublished. She gave it into the hands of someone she trusted, asking them to see that it was published when the time was right. And that person was also, the time was not right. And he died, and he passed it on to yet a third person, and that person eventually got the book published by, as coincidentally, Putnam, who is my publisher in the U.S., eventually brought out Asia's book. But it's very, you can sometimes read between the lines of her loving portraits and think, well, this actually, there's an episode where a local man insults his mother, and John Wilkes goes and beats him nearly to death, which Asia thinks is just such a lovely chivalrous thing to have done. And she's got this weird, at the end, she is trying so hard to agree that the murder of Abraham Lincoln was a terrible crime. She says, we all feel it was a terrible crime. And then she says, of course, if he'd been in church and not a theater, no one would have killed him. That it was, it was his mistake to choose such a frivolous activity when the country was so deep in mourning. So she can't stop herself at the end from pretending that Lincoln is also very responsible for having been murdered. But yes, I think I share your feeling in particular about the way the family leaned on him. And this is maybe also something about the past being a different country, that it's just sort of astonishing to me that in a family where you have 3 adult women, they do not lift a finger to feed and make sure that the necessities are there. And they depend entirely on a 14-year-old boy to manage the farm and support them all, which he is unable to do, and they nearly starve. One of the really interesting things to me in the book, in the research, is just how many times John Wilkes Booth almost died. Yeah. And yet, he escaped death again and again and again.
And maybe I'd just add one quick comment or something of a question about sort of empathizing with him. your book, and sort of there's the interesting parallel there with the sort of teenage shootings in America, which I think you make in the epilogues as well, or in the after the back material. But you see the impact of kind of sort of almost mythical events on the nubile adolescent brain, right? So there's this incident at the Gorsuch family farm that maybe you could just briefly mention before we give Otto the question, but maybe you could mention that, because I think you sort of see how this event is imprinted on him at an age which I think is known to be a very formative age, right? What we take on in those years becomes very formative to who we are.
Yes, this is the Battle of Christiana, an event which actually impacted all of the South, I think, very profoundly. But John Wilkes in particular, because he went to school with one of the Gorsuch boys and had spent time on the Gorsuch plantation, knew the people involved. So what happened is that some enslaved people on the Gorsuch plantation ran, and they made it to Christiana, Pennsylvania. And apparently, Mr. Gorsuch was initially so persuaded by his own vision of himself as a lovely, benevolent person that he waited a long time. He assumed that the men would come back on their own, which, surprise, they did not. And so he went to recover them. And this was during the period of the Fugitive Slave Act. So he was acting within the legal parameters of the time that he could not be kept from these men, but he was. A black abolitionist was sheltering them, and when he showed up with the sheriff and the law to recover the men, it ended up in a shootout, and Gorsuch was killed. And the fact that this had happened, that he had been killed, and also that there was a trial in Christiana over his death, and no one was found guilty for it, was just incredibly galling to the South. That, here a man innocently trying to recover his property should be murdered by, particularly by black abolitionists, and then no one sent to jail over it, was something that bothered John Wilkes for the rest of his life, rest of his short life.
I have a question. Thank you very much for coming. On writing during the pandemic and how that works differently from your other books, and just give us a clue of how you wrote this book. I
think it's arguable that without the pandemic, I would not have finished the book. I spent a great deal of time on email, and I spent a great deal of time on various political sites. It's completely possible for me to spend an entire day where I start off looking at my email, I answer the things that really need to be answered. I have about 7 political sites I take a quick look at. By the time I've done that, I think I probably have some new emails. I go look. I do. I answer them. That takes about 20 minutes. I think as bad as the political situation was 20 minutes ago, I bet it's worse now. And I go look. I am never wrong. It always is. And then I think, I bet I have some new emails, and it's quite possible for me to spend an entire day circling between my emails and my political sites. About 2:30 or 3, I'm tired. I go to bed filled with self-loathing. I think, I really wanted to write today. So the pandemic was very helpful for me because not only was I living a very boring life myself, which was helpful, but I'm often living a very boring life. But all of my friends were also living very boring lives, so the emails were not entertaining, and it was, I had a lot more time to work on my book.
You tell me, Tracy, are we done?
I have one question, which I think, what about Mary Todd Lincoln, who I assume is also in your book? Do you have what you write
Do I
about
have
her?
feelings about Mary Todd Lincoln? You know, she's just such a really tragic figure. I think much like my Asia, you look at the things that happened in her life and you cannot help but be filled with sympathy. It just seems like such a difficult life. And yet she's such an unpleasant and unlikable person that you swing back and forth between thinking, well, she really is making Abe's life a misery. And now she's lost another child, and who among us would be able to survive with any sort of, you know, she, of their 4 children, I think, 3 died. 2 died before Abraham Lincoln died, and 1 after. And so the only surviving child was Robert Lincoln, the oldest, and he had her put in an insane asylum. So obviously it was not the best mother-son relationship. I feel very sorry for her. On the other hand, I do think she made her husband's life a misery.
There are a couple more questions, if that's okay. Yep, if 5 more minutes, let's try and get there. There's 1 in the middle, 2 in the back. Maybe we do all 3 at the same time. No? No? Okay, we'll do 1 by 1. Just trying to compress.
Okay, hi. So I haven't actually read the book, but after your talk, I'll definitely read it. But I had a question about the perspective of the book, because partly it's out of the perspective of Rosalie. I was wondering if you talk about the perspective of John Wilkes, and if not, why not? Was it because he didn't deserve it, or it was too complicated, or what were the reasons?
This is a complicated question. I was very determined not to write a book in which John Wilkes Booth was the center, to the extent that that was possible. And sometimes it was possible and sometimes it wasn't. But I also felt, this is the first historical novel I've ever written. I've written historical novels before, but they have involved fictional stories and fictional characters, and only the setting has been historical. So this is the first one in which I actually took recognizable and famous figures and tried to inhabit their minds and their hearts. And I felt, on the one hand, I really enjoyed it, and I love reading historical novels that do that. And on the other hand, I felt very uncomfortable about pretending that I actually knew, you know, what was going on in their minds, when obviously I don't. And I think I was, as I said when I was talking, I really don't know how it came to be that John Wilkes murdered Abraham Lincoln. There are too many possibilities, including his rivalry with his brother, and a sort of cadre of people kind of encouraging each other towards this end. So I felt that I did not know the answer to that question, and that I could not inhabit his mind and not answer that question.
Okay.
And since I couldn't answer it, I couldn't inhabit his mind.
Can I have one more? And one more question. So there are a lot of motives about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. but are they very different, or are they kind of related to each other, or?
I've only seen a couple myself. I've seen the Steven Spielberg. Is it called The Conspirators or The Conspiracy, something like that? And I guess there's one with Daniel Day-Lewis, maybe just called Lincoln.
Oh no, that was not my question. I was.
Oh, I completely misunderstood. I'm sorry, say again.
Oh, well, there are a lot of motives about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but are they intertwined? Are they related, or are they very different?
I think, I think there's some accuracy to all of them, so I guess I would say they are intertwined. I don't think any of them are untrue.
Okay.
I would assume some of them are more powerfully true than others, and I don't know. One of the things that that was interesting about this family is the extent to which the younger children in particular were so invested in the family name and in burnishing it in some way and in making it a respectable name and honoring their father's legacy. And I think that, that John Wilkes, as I said, had this kind of outsized sense of destiny. He saw himself as the hero in a kind of grand narrative. And that when I looked most closely at the assassination, one of the things that really struck me was how theatrical it was. He's got lines he's going to deliver. He's got blocking. He's going to make this leap onto the stage. It's all, it's a scene from a play, and that is all worked out. And so, again, I think one of the motives was certainly just sort of his sense of having a place in history. And he was very, about 6 months before the assassination, he and two of his brothers, June and Edwin, performed in Julius Caesar in New York City. It was the only time the three brothers ever performed together. And he was very unhappy to learn that he was not going to play Brutus, which is the character he wanted. And in his diaries after the assassination, he also compared himself to he did not understand why he was not being accorded the admiration that he felt that Brutus had gotten and that he apparently expected.
Okay. Well, thank you.
We have time for one more question. And maybe if you have burning questions, you can email them to Karen, and depending on her mood, she might respond.
I have one burning question. I would like to take it full circle to the beginning of your talk. You talked about allowing people their narrative, and you don't need to be American to be totally done with that right now. So would it be a way to use time travel to go back and fix that once and for all? I would like to pick your brain on that, knowing how you think about history and historic events.
Well, as an aficionado of many time travel stories, it seems to me that usually what happens is a sort of cascade of unexpected consequences where the thing you thought you were going to fix is not fixed. I don't remember the author of this story. I read this story when I was quite young, but it's a time travel story where the world is in a terrible state and has what feels like a very vicious history, which is in fact our history. And there's a time traveler who goes back and fixes all of these things in order to make us a better people, just a kinder, more generous, more thoughtful species. And then when aliens come, we are completely unprepared to defend ourselves. We are, little lambs to the slaughter because because all of our worst instincts have been bred out of us. So I feel we're at a desperate time. I am willing to send someone back to try to fix it. I completely understanding that it probably won't work out well for us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Karen will sign books outside, and I'm sure we will continue this conversation. And also for the last one or two people who weren't able to pose your question, she'll be here for a while, and seems like you're enjoying yourself.
I love the Q&A. It's my favorite part.
Yeah.
I know what I'm going to say, but I don't know what you're going to say.
Let me just tell you briefly about what's coming up at the John Adams in this season. On October 3rd, we are hosting Francis Fukuyama for, what is it, I think the fifth time now? Fourth? Fifth? Fifth. Liberalism and Its Discontents is his new book. On October 11th, we have an event which is particularly dear to my heart. It's the New York Times reporter Andrea Elliott and two-time Pulitzer winner will be talking about her book, Invisible Child. For 8 years, she followed a girl of the Dasani Coates, who lived in Brooklyn, a black girl, and her family, shelter in, shelter out, crappy apartment, in, out, children in foster care, out again, writing about what the insecurity of homelessness does to a family. And I think, as all of us know, homelessness is a huge issue now in the United States. Everyone I know who visits the US comes back and says, how is this possible? So we thought it was very important to do an event about homelessness, and Andrea's book is magnificent. So I hope you'll join us and spread the word that she's coming. November 10th is our midterms event. Katie will be joining us. And this is my moment to tell you about Katie's book, since she didn't do it herself. We have asked her to join us because of this book as a historian. She has written a book called The Machine Has a Soul, American Sympathy with Italian Fascism. So that gives you some idea of what her talk will be about. And one of our, actually the focal point of our evening will be a Dutch person, which is very unusual for us, Casper Thomas, who is just now departing as the American correspondent for the Financieel Dagblad. And he's written a book, sorry it's so cheery this evening, called America's Last Chance. And then to finish off the year on a happy note, we have an online event on December 15th with Susan Matthews. Susan Matthews is an accomplished podcast maker with Slate, and she made this spring a four-part podcast about Roe versus Wade. And I think for all of us realize what a huge impact the undoing of the Roe versus Wade decision is having on the United States. And I'm really looking forward to hearing her about her research and about all the huge social movement that went into making Roe v. Wade and how simple it was to unmake it. It's unnerving. You might enjoy listening to our podcast, Bright Minds, and I think you will also, especially after this evening, enjoy reading our blog, which was written a few months ago by the New York photographer Brian Rose. I had to think of it when Karen said the history of the Civil War is so divisive. He went back to his home state of Virginia and did a photo reportage on a large number of controversial monuments, Confederate monuments, slavery, and how they were taken down. It's a very strong blog and beautiful images, so I'm sure you'll enjoy having a look at that. And I'd like to close the evening by saying, sign up for our newsletter if you haven't yet, and consider joining us as a member or a patron or a friend or even a member of our family. And we're looking forward to seeing you back again very soon. Thanks for joining, and we'll be having drinks together and book signing outside. Thanks so much.